we have this problem is the problem with title deeds. We just do not have clear titles. And there are states where the cadastral surveys still go back to the 1920s. There are, however, states, Gujarat amongst the largest states is one good example of that, among the smaller ones, Goa, where the survey records are up to date. The cadastral maps are up to date. So you've got the revenue records, you've got the satellite imagery, and you've been able to match the two together. So it's not as if nothing is happening. And I should also quickly mention to you that part of the problem with land has been that I will always have titles that are not clean. And we have been going round and round in circles thinking about it in a binary kind of way until we can clean up everything. We will not do anything. But litigation will probably involve 25% of the cases, 30% of the cases, in the remainder where everything is clean. Why not go ahead? And certainly one place where land titles are reasonably clean are things that are actually owned by the government. So one of the things that is happening, and you will not read about it in the newspapers, because as a government you sometimes don't want to announce things, create a hype, and then you find you haven't delivered. It's far better not to announce anything to the newspapers, do it and then announce it. One of the things you will find happening in some parts of the northern capital region is what is almost like an Aadhaar number for a plot of land. So I have the complete track record. Everything for that will be clean. It costs a little bit of money, so I will give Sudarshan the option. Do you want the unclean system, or do you want to pay that little bit extra and migrate to the clean system? So this, as I said, you will soon see in the northern capital region. Hopefully you will see it in Chandigarh. You will probably see it in Goa. You might have seen it in Telangana, but now the Chief Minister has got other things in his mind, so I don't know whether it's going to happen there or not. So that's on business. One of the things, Naresh said it in a way, so let me state it a little bit. Our dear friend Anup Pujari used to be in MSME. When he was there, 95% of MSME enterprises were not registered under any legislation. I'm not even talking about Companies Act, not even the proprietorship legislation. Since he left, the figure has gone up to 97%. You cannot mandatorily force enterprises to register. There are supposed to be benefits from registration. Nonetheless, if people are not registered, presumably the procedural costs are too high or the perceived collateral damage is too high. But you cannot possibly force them to register. One of the problems with this has been that historically there have been no satisfactory exit provisions for MSME. So the concept of limited liability has not existed. So when the enterprise failed, the entrepreneur failed. One of the good things that has happened recently is the IBC, which enables for the first time satisfactory bankruptcy, insolvency provisions for the MSME, provided they are legally registered under something. If they are not legally registered, we still not have been able to figure out what is done. Now let me turn to access to justice. The figure, Naresh, is 30 million now. And in the good old days, Supreme Court, it used to be 20,000. There was a large start. Today, Supreme Court is 60,000. The problem really is, it is very easy to talk about number of judges. But there's a difference between the working strength and the sanction strength. And I'm not only talking about the Supreme Court and the High Courts, which are extremely visible, I'm also talking about the lower courts. Filling vacancies in the lower courts is really the responsibility, the right, everything of the division. 30% vacancies. So if I could fill those vacancies in time, that would amount to, back of the envelope, a 30% increase in productivity. I still have not been able to understand what. Well, you have a registrar, right? Every sensible place does. Because people like Rajkumar and Sudarshan are good at teaching. They are not necessarily good at managing things. I've still not been able to understand why the judiciary is so very reluctant to hand over case flow management to a professional and do what they are supposed to do. I've still not been able to understand why the Supreme Court cannot insist on case flow being monitored and the template for case flow to be enforced in all the states. In the year 2001-2002, there were amendments to the Civil Procedure Code. And at that time, we all thought that the average civil case would be resolved in a maximum of 18 months because of the procedural simplifications that the Civil Procedure Code contributes. You're all lawyers here. You know effectively a court judgment has thrown that to the dogs. Now I'm left with the 2.5 anecdotes. The half anecdote is Rajasthan. There used to be a survey of best police stations in the world. Not too many countries took part. India was one. I repeat, not too many countries took part. Believe it or not, there's a police station in Rajasthan which has been voted the best in the world. Next time you go to Jaipur, I will recommend you will see that. It's a police station in Vidhayakpur. 715 police stations in Rajasthan, all significantly. I will not get into the details. But across police stations in India, now, the Ministry of Home Affairs ranks them. And just look at the website to see what this does to the police stations in terms of competition amongst themselves to be ranked high. And the police stations that are right at the top are not police stations of the metros. Well, the last ranking I saw, they are from smaller towns. Now the two anecdotes, substantial anecdotes, and this is information you are not familiar with. First one again, Rajasthan. As I said, you need a champion. And for a state government, the natural champion, perhaps the only champion, is the Chief Minister. We have statutes. Statutes are the union government level or the state government. Sudarshan mentioned the law reforms project I was involved in. At that time, we had access to all the union government statutes. The original intention behind large was also to look at state government statutes, but no one had any idea of how many state government statutes there were, because no one had copies. So I got hold of a book published, a series, State Laws. I got hold of Orissa, and I found at that time Orissa had 1015. So I multiplied by the number of states then and went around quoting there are 25,000 statutes in India, which is incorrect by the way. You will still find it quoted by all kinds of people, but it's wrong. So I told the Chief Minister in Rajasthan, the ex-Chief Minister now, let's try and simplify the statutes for Rajasthan. And when I say simplify, I do not mean getting rid of the old ones which Parth Shah has been pushing for. That's in a sense easier, where you can outright identify old pieces of legislation, say they should be repeated. That's easier. Much more difficult is rationalizing and harmonizing what remains after that. Went to the law department in Rajasthan. How many statutes are there? Here is the list. How many? 900. Alright, fine, 900. We want to find the texts. The texts. For 50 of these, the texts were not available. The assembly did not have a copy. The governor's office did not have a copy. The chief minister's office did not have a copy. By the way, the chief minister was advised by the legal department to set up a state level law commission. She said, I want the work done, I don't want the law commission. So she set up a 2-person team. I was the chairperson and the additional secretary was the other member. So the additional secretary had a brainwave. These statutes, after some time, obviously, you need some time to think before you have a brainwave. So he said these must have been printed at some point in time. So let's go to the government printing press. The government printing press always keeps copies. So we went to the government printing press and eventually got all 900. And then the fight started. Because, as you'd expect, or at least people who work for the government know, every piece of legislation is owned by a government department. It's its IPR, not IPR. It's its property. It does not want to part with the property. How can you get rid of my property? So every legislation that gets stuck, I request the Chief Minister, please hold a meeting. With you chairing it, please tell them they have to relinquish their rights to this piece of legislation. In the process, to cut the long story short, from 900 statutes, we brought it down to 150. As in, went through cabinet. About 50 of them involved ideological positions. Now, what do I mean by ideological positions? Voting Regulation Act. You want the state government to regulate votes. In that sense, ideology. Now, some people thought that the government should. So, the Voting Regulation Act is still there. Once those things also went, we would have brought it down to 100. And remember, before that, again, one of the problems was people did not know what the law was. It was not available to you. So one of the offshoots of what we did was everything was put up on the website in English and in Hindi. So every legislation that now remains is out there on the website in English and in Hindi. What we could not do, what we intended to do had she got re-elected, was now do the rules. We just did the acts, the statutes, not the rules. The last amendment. Again, something you will not hear about. It's called LIMS. Legal Information Management Briefing System. It's a purely union government initiative. You will not find any details of it except the bare bones. You will not get any of the data. Now, what is the idea behind this? A long time ago, when Sudarshan had roped me into the large project, there was a study done for the High Court of Karnataka. And this study found that in civil cases, in 60% of civil cases, the government was a litigant, sometimes on both sides. And 95% of government appeals failed. Now, people forget that this was Karnataka High Court for one particular year. It will invariably be quoted everywhere as if it is universally true of India. So he thought, alright, let us look at just the union government. Where is the union government litigating? And so far as the union government is concerned, Let's track those cases. Let's track those 4,500 courts. Let's see what kinds of cases. Why is it pointlessly appealing? And if it is similar, all cases tend to be similar in some fashion. So if you know what has happened in the past, you can with a reasonable degree of certainty, not absolute certainty, predict what is going to happen. So don't litigate. And by the way, for the government litigation, the success rate in appeals is actually, the higher up you go, the lower the success rate. In other words, it reinforces the point you should not be able. Now the limbs at the union government level, it has been phenomenally successful in improving efficiency over there. For example, you have government appointed lawyers. And until LIMS was there, we did not know that there were 5 lawyers who got all the cases. And the others never got any cases, except they were there. Now, there was no absolute rhyme or reason except the obvious as to why these cases were concentrated with 4 or 5 lawyers. So, LIMS has improved in efficiency enormously. I told you, you'll find references to LIMS, but obviously the data is not for public access or research, not yet. But again, one of the things I would like to see happen in this country is for something like OPGINDAL, push the idea of LIMS in state courts, because that's where the bulk of the litigation is. Here, it's primarily service matters or rates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like the Vice Chancellor, as a token of our thanks and appreciation to our 2 speakers, to do the honors, which is the university scarf and a memento, before we have this open discussion.
Thank you very much. Are you allowed to accept him?
There is no such thing, but now that you mention it, since I've got so many of these, perhaps I can send this to the Tosha Khan. There's no goal plating.
All right. So we've had 2 very rich presentations, and Vivek has some very concrete proposals for work that we should be doing in public policy school, or law school, and university. Exciting anecdotes that need to be followed up. So I'd like to open the floor for a discussion on this subject. And the way I'm going to do this is to kick it off, not look around and say who's raised their hands, but ask some people who I think will have interesting perspectives that our students will particularly benefit from hearing. So I'd like to begin with Anup Pujari to say a few words. No, you wouldn't want to do that? Then pass. Since down the line. Yes, yes, down the line. And after that, I'll take a show of hands. But you know,
I mean, just picking up on what Vivek said about the repeal law project. Right, what CCS has been trying to do is to repeal the laws which are sort of expired, in the sense there is no much value involved. But we found even doing that has been so challenging. Right? So the laws where there is no defense at all, by and large, there's nobody who has to lose anything like the laws that we talked about. At the state level, even though we have a list of 25 laws for every state, hardly any one of them has gone through to the state legislature. So I agree with you that there is a lot more to be done there. You know, I want to look at, again, more about Rajasthan scenario that we talked about. We worthwhile to look at how that has been done in terms of the simplification of it. And that's something that's worthwhile to do. For at least economic, which is our area of focus, personal freedom and economic freedom. We look at those from that point of view. And if you have any thoughts on that, I'm happy to use that. I think just one simple point about the informal sector that Dr. Singh talked about. Right? Is one thing to get a law in place, like the Street Vendor Act of 2014, right, which is a law in place which actually changes the whole scenario about legality of street vendors. Before the law, it was up to the street vendor to prove that they are not a new public nuisance, right, and then they were allowed to exist. After the law, now the state has to prove they are a public nuisance, and therefore they need to be removed or resettled, right? And so that's the huge, in a sense, change in the fundamental nature of who has the right to vend. But we just produce a report with the help of the urban ministry, looking at the data across the states of India. Out of 7,000, some cities they are supposed to have implemented this law. Less than 2,500 of them actually have done it. Right? So even simple thing of this kind, it's just difficult to even after getting a law passed to get it through the system to implement it. I wonder there is some way of thinking about generally about such laws that exist in India, right? Just focusing on India, and how can we then begin to see that implementation is a challenge, and the gap which exists there, can we sort of begin to point out those gaps in more systemic manner?
Yes,
Please, that's a dialogue.
see, what first thing that I want to say is, I'm saying this because Parth knows about it, but some of you may not. That through 5 bills at the union government level, about 1,518 old laws are now being repealed. That's a significant amount since 2015. Sometimes people are not aware of this. There are another 235 that are awaiting repeal because they are pre-constitution statutes, but post-constitution they are the province of the states. So it's up to the states that have to repeal them. There have been several letters to states. Most states have not. All states have not even bothered to reply. The other comment that I have is one looks for a champion, and then one needs to negotiate the process. That's still recording, isn't it? It is recording. I'll give you an example of this law.
No, this is not recorded.
This is what is recording. Anyway, can you just switch it off? Just switch it off. 2 minute के लिए बंद कर. 2 minute के लिए बंद कर. और क्या? जी सर. क्या है ना? जी. See, we had a. It doesn't matter. I can read my voice. We had a problem with a large number of laws at the state government level that revenue. Large number, understandably, and we had a problem with the revenue department and the secretary in the revenue department, because he was not only reluctant to give up these laws, which were the department's property, he also insisted that I and the additional chief secretary did not have any drafting experience. So who are these people to draft the legislation? They had no experience. So I told the additional chief secretary, why don't you have an informal chat with him and find out what he wants? Lo and behold, all that he wanted is, he knew a lawyer, a legal firm, and he wanted to give a project to that legal firm for X amount of money. So I went and told the chief minister, let him give that project. Don't hold it against him. Let him give that project, but use our draft. This is what we did. So there are some vested interests, but once one negotiates the process, if you find the chief minister, and at the state government level, I repeat, it has to be the chief minister, or it has to be an equivalent minister with a sufficient amount of clout. Otherwise, they forget.
You can switch that on.
Now, Raj, do you want to?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Naresh and Vivek, for those fantastic presentations. I have a fundamental point about this. One, first of all, I think, at least in India, we have never taken any effort to create a legal system seriously. This is after we passed the constitution, there was absolutely no effort, and I make a very serious charge that in this country we have never taken the entire legislative process seriously. We pass laws so easily and so frequently with little and or no imagination whatsoever, and very quickly we also work towards its amendments, and then they go through judicial process and lots of loopholes emerge, litigation emerges, and courts are actually called to navigate and mitigate those contradictions and those challenges in the law itself. So the first step that if you're serious about is that we need to develop a new imagination for legislative process, and it's so interesting that most of the laws, if we really want to go through the process, it's actually done by ministry officials themselves and not necessarily law commission. And if you really want a law not to be passed, then you ask the law commission to do it, because then that will go through a very long process and never see the light of day. The second thing is that, and so this is connected to drafting and looking at judicial manageable standards, looking at the possibility of litigation, the judicial impact assessment, to what extent it's going to create a burden on the judicial process and new law. I mean, if you look at US, for example, the lawmaking process is extremely complex. Layers and layers of checks and balances are introduced into it, and you just can't just let that pass a law, and that's why it's very complex. The second thing which I think Vivek, I want to respond to, while I like the idea of all these removing legislations and all these old ones, I am convinced nothing is going to happen because of that when it comes to the delays and the problems, the challenges of the legal system. There, the real issue is one of the things which the government should seriously do is to work towards. I mean, we know 70% of the litigation is government is party. That's kind of public knowledge. But we have not been able to develop an understanding that the delays should not be caused by the government itself. So you have a situation where today, almost as an automatic principle, cases are appealed. Decisions from all the way from lower court to high court, etc. And I've spoken to a number of people, and it's almost like a defensive mechanism. Because if you don't appeal on a matter, the system is such that the bureaucrats feel if they don't sanction an appeal, there is a good chance that in the future somebody might question that why they did not appeal on a verdict that was supposed to be, let's say, not favorable. So that sort of sense of, let's say, insecurity and potential bias, prejudice charge is being responded to by automatic appeal process. And of course, we all know the adjournment framework on the basis of which our legal system is governed. We have no mechanism to ensure that. And the third, I think, is we have not explored this, and I know we are slightly skeptical about it. But we really need to double the strength of our judiciary, and that's part of our investment. We just cannot deal with the situation where you expect, if this is a problem that we are seeing and we are not finding solution. Mark Galanter told many years ago that it's not that in India we are a highly litigious society. It's not that so many people are going to courts. It's that those stuff that goes in doesn't come out easily. So the real challenge is we need to increase capacity. Now I take it that there are incompetent judges and they are slow at times. There are delays in that. But if you really want to address that problem, you need to look at radical solutions. I mean, the current government is good at finding radical solutions. Demonetization was an attempt to do a radical solution. Why not double the strength of the judiciary? Let's make it radical.
Okay, so let me react to you. Firstly, on the judiciary. Resources are essentially a reflection of priorities. And the priorities through parliament reflect the perceptions. My personal opinion is until the judiciary demonstrates to citizens that it is willing to clean up its act, you will never get support for greater resources for judiciary. As long as courts have holidays, there's a difference between courts having holidays and judges having holidays. I have no objection to your going on leave, as I'm sure you do, but does that mean that OP Jindal closes down while you're on leave? I presume not. So why does the Supreme Court still have these summer vacations? The simple point I'm making is the judiciary has not demonstrated that it is willing to subject itself to scrutiny, improve its productivity, and therefore I do not think there will be any support for greater resources for the judiciary. The perception about the judiciary is still sunny, and it has not changed. So that would be my first response. The second response to the first one is actually, I think people would be better off reading texts on Vedanta. Why am I bringing in Vedanta? Because in very, very simple terms, Vedanta tells you that you are insignificant, you don't make any difference, you cannot influence the world. The trouble, of course, is that the moment you become a member of parliament or a member of the legislative assembly, you think you can change the world. So every little thing, if I do not pass a statute, what is the point of my being there? And I completely agree that we do need, you said judicial impact assessment, but I would want to refine that expression further and say there is legislative impact assessment and there is a judicial decision impact assessment. We need to have both. I'm stressing the second one as well. The trouble is, once upon a time we used to have that in the statement of objects and reasons. Today, ostensibly the statement of objects and reasons exists, but it says absolutely nothing at all. But I completely agree about making the drafting simple. The trouble with the Law Commission, of course, is, and I'm defending the government here, or some segments of the government here, that you ask the Law Commission for a draft. Today's Law Commission takes 3 years. And sometimes you cannot afford to wait 3 years. But I also would say writing in plain language, something that there's now a template actually, which the government has been using for some of this. A template prepared by, which is the Delhi-based one, Vidi or Dash? Which one? Vidi.
But yeah, if I go back quickly to answer the point you made, a lot of it was answered by Vivek, but
Sorry, I didn't answer. The appeals, this is exactly what LIMS is doing. This is precisely the purpose behind it.
that's important. So the point I was going to make was 2 things. One was to react to what Vivek said about volume 2. When he was talking about CLEP, some of you might have heard him say CLEP without spelling it out. All he meant was the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. And the report, in fact, if you Google making the law work for everyone, 2 volumes will come up now.
The second one also.
It comes up now. And in volume 2, there are 5 chapters. The first 4 chapters are the 4 pillars. The last chapter is the one that Vivek started to draft and was completed by others. Because he got too busy or something, or he had a fight with some politician. But
Not here.
not here. As the executive director of the commission, I can't tell you all these in-house stories, but that last chapter is roadmaps and exactly the kinds of things that he's talking about power. The issue about stakeholder analysis, the issue about getting a champion, and then finding a way through the system. We document all of it there, incentives and disincentives, and so on. I had a conversation like that with the Street Vendors Association of India. I think it was. They had 1 million members at that time. You have written on this as well, I think. And we had this exact conversation. And I did hear, and I think Madhu Kishwar was telling me about successes that they were having. So there are pathways, pretty tortuous, but you can make some success. But if you take a look at chapter 5 of volume 2 of that work, it gives a little bit of insights. I hope others will read it too, because clearly you alone can't manage this very difficult process.
There's one thing, Sudarshan, there's one thing maybe I should say, because there are students there, and I don't know whether the students are aware of this. This flows from something Raj said, and I presumed you know this, but maybe you don't. There is an act called the Prevention of Corruption Act. The Prevention of Corruption Act, the current Prevention of Corruption Act is 1988. Except in the title of the act, it thereafter does not use the word corruption. It thereafter uses the word criminal misconduct. And there is one particular section of the Prevention of Corruption Act. Is it 13(2)(d)(3)? 13(2)(d)(3), which says, as a public servant, I am guilty of criminal misconduct if I have taken a decision and that decision benefits a third party. I'm not taking a bribe, it's not nepotism. I take a decision and it benefits a third party. Almost tautologically, every decision I take will benefit some third party or the other. But because that is there, then because of the possible threat of vigilance inquiries and CBI, etc., as long as that exists, almost every public servant definitionally will be risk averse. And this is not just about appeals, it cuts across everything. The Prevention of Corruption Act today, it does not punish the mala fide decision maker adequately, nor does it protect the bona fide decision maker adequately, whether it's the bureaucrat or the minister. There was an attempt to improve it, to punish the mala fide and protect the bona fide. Unfortunately, went to the standing committee, and the standing committee diluted it, and therefore the problem that Raj alluded to still remains.
No, I just wanted to take up a remark that Vivek made, which is, why does the judiciary not allow professionals to manage the entire system? Now, this is an old problem. I mean, these are called the noble professions, and this is a characteristic of these noble professions, which are medicine, law, and teaching. And in all of these professions, the people involved somehow think that their decisions and their work would be compromised if they handed over to another set of professionals key decisions. Now, one area where this has been, to a large extent, been solved is in medicine, because the idea that inventories of drugs and procurement of equipment and so on in the hospital should be managed by the doctors themselves is sort of given way. It's also, to some extent, given way, maybe too much given way in academia, because now we all hear the complaint that it's the administrators in academia who are making all the decisions, they are paid fat salaries, and the faculty has become marginalized. I mean, this is a complaint. But the one field where it has not happened at all is in the judiciary, because judges somehow think that their work in delivering justice would be compromised if they hand it over. No, because things like sentencing, you can remove a whole lot of discretionary elements there. But After a person has been found guilty and convicted, then there's another set of hearings on what should be the quantum of sentence. Now this in most jurisdictions could happen automatically if you had a good administrative system that runs it, so that there's some fairness and some transparency. So this is a problem, but it's not insurmountable. In other words, even though the noble professions have clung to administering themselves and not trusting others, change is possible and must be pushed through. Unfortunately, we are with the judiciary, which has become kind of, it appoints itself and is making public policy every other day, and so we are up against a very difficult task. And as students of public policy, we know that all policy has to be translated into law to be enforced in some way, and then you come up with another set of actors who have no clue as to why the policy was drafted in the way it is in the first place. What is the objective? They would look at language and so on, and so this problem of translating policy. So one of the things I've discovered is that there is a whole way, and I want Paul to come in on this, is the way these discourses work. That is, a policymaker would think in terms of more or less. A rich person can be taxed more. A poorer person can be taxed at a lower rate. This seems to be absolutely logical and sensible. But when it comes to the judges, they somehow think in terms of all or nothing. Either everybody, should have a right to property, or no one should have a right to property. Now, this is part of the way. So I think there is a challenge in terms of a law school training people in the way you think about the law.
So the law and economics.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make the point. I wanted to ask Paul for his reflections on this observation.
Okay, well, thank you, Sudarshan. I mean, I can only speak as an outsider and not a legal expert, but I wanted to offer a comment and pick up a little bit what you just said, which may or may not lead to a question. My comment was simply to looking at these four pillars, and thank you very much for your presentations, which I found extremely illuminating. It struck me that the first pillar has a lot of baggage. More particularly, it's two separate themes: access to justice and the rule of law. There's two huge ideas there. So access to justice seems to be much more mechanical and technical. And we've talked about ignorance as a barrier, exclusion, social exclusion as a barrier. What we haven't talked about is money. Now, in Britain, there's a huge debate, has been since probably the 1980s, since Mrs. Thatcher's time, about what we call the legal aid budget. The legal aid budget is seen as crucial by lawyers and by, if you like, Liberal Democrats, as being a key element in a fair and just legal process, and indeed democracy in its widest sense. But the budget has been bashed regularly. It's an easy budget to bash. It's very difficult to defend because the defendants are people from the future who might need legal aid. So it's not like tuition fees and students, because there's always a constituency that's going to go into the streets or whatever and protest. So it regularly gets slashed. Occasionally it gets increased when a new government comes in. So the question in my mind is how can it work in India? How does it work in India? Because it seems to me that at some point, if you're poor, you're going to need some kind of money. Or maybe, I mean, this is just an idea, because I know that in rural communities and villages, they are now identifying individuals and giving them special, maybe some extra health training to deal with localized health issues. Maybe you give a cell phone to somebody who can then act as a common point of reference for emergencies, and maybe we could actually think of having slightly trained legal officers who might then act on behalf of those who are oppressed. So the question of access to justice seems to me critical but technical. And then we come to the rule of law, and actually Raj touched on that far better than I can. I mean, clearly as a political scientist, there's no doubt India has the rule of law. Okay, you have separation of powers, you have a constitution, you have a very advanced, and you've been discussing it, almost too advanced body of law, too complicated maybe, but it's there. And yet, the first thing that an outsider notices is the law doesn't work in India. So when they say to me, is there a rule of law? Sometimes, when I'm off guard after 2 whiskeys, I say no. But clearly I'm wrong. Clearly I'm wrong, because it's not like Russia, it's not like China, and yet, it's worrying, and that's why this seminar, I think, is perfect, So we've got to think about that. I like the idea of champions for reform. I don't know if you have, like we have, a law commission which is constantly looking at different things and completely independently recommending ideas, but implementation is obviously a big issue for Indians. But it's the sense of justice that I'm worried about. I can see it in the Supreme Court, it's perfect. Not perfect, but it's pretty damn good. It's enviable. It's globally enviable. You've got some brilliant people. I had the pleasure of spending 2 hours with someone called Fali Nariman, who happens to live in the house I used to live in when I was a kid. I went to look at the house and I met him. What a pleasure. So you have some wonderful legal brains here. But that sense of justice as you go down the system, we all know, begins to evaporate. And we've got to get some kind of pride into the profession where people actually feel proud of getting a right result, not taking 18 years, but 18 months.
So, Paul, this issue of the rule of law, I take your point about access to justice being more technical and being a sort of a subset as a means towards the rule of law. We had this big debate, so let me share a little bit with you. In fact, when we set up this working group in the Commission on access to justice and the rule of law, I asked Justice Anthony Kennedy, the name you might know. Anthony Kennedy, for many people, was a member of the US Supreme Court. He was a member of our commission. So I asked Justice Kennedy to recommend somebody as the rapporteur for this working group. And he thought about it and he said, I'll send you an email, which he did. And the person he recommended was one of his former clerks, who was now a professor of law at Harvard. And he had a JD and a PhD in political science and so on. Right guy. And clerked with Justice Kennedy. And I discussed it with him. He says he'll come on board and he will work with us. However, he would like us to change the name of the working group to Access to Justice alone. No rule of law because it means nothing. So I was stunned. Justice Kennedy, on the other hand, had written out the principles of the rule of law on a bookmark. And he would hand out, every meeting we will go to together, and I went to many of those with him, he will hand out that bookmark that explained what the rule of law meant. I was recently teaching a course in the pro-law program in Rome at Loyola University. And I cited an article called Order in the Jungle in The Economist of several years ago. And what that article does very well is they conducted a survey among economists. And they asked economists whether there was a relationship between the rule of law and economic growth. And all of them said yes. Then they were asked, so what is the rule of law? And none of them knew what it was, but they all agreed. So that's the problem. And the answer, as you probably know, lies in the explanation of the thick and thin bundles of the rule of law. The thick one being democracy, values, norms, the perception of a rule of law, which Anthony Kennedy called a culture of the rule of law. The thin bundles is the ones we have addressed. Property rights, contracts enforcement, business law, labor rights, all of these are the thin bundle. Then you can make a direct correlation with economic performance and anything else. And that is what would help to clarify that apparent conundrum conceptually at least.
Well, a proper response would take us outside what we are discussing. So, nonetheless, let me respond. But before that, Another way of looking at it is, you may not have realized, but I was referring to a Hindi film called Damini when I mentioned Sunny Deol. There is another Hindi film called Jolly LLB. I'm not sure whether it is Jolly LLB. Yes, it was Jolly LLB, not Jolly LLB 2, where the judge comments that had people still not had faith in rule of law, then you would not have had the courts so crowded. So I would be very reluctant to say that there is no belief in the court system. Just sort of look at it in the very back of the envelope kind of sense, nothing more than the back of the envelope. Cross simplification, but I hope the point. 30 million cases. If you include quasi-judicial, 35. So yes, sometimes some of these are criminal disputes, but let us say 60 million people litigating. 60 million people litigating is more than 25% of the country. So if more than 25% of the country is litigating, there is clearly some faith in rule of law. And they are not doing the angry young man Amitabh Bachchan stuff of the 1970s and 1960s when you took the law into your own hands. Having said that, there is a more serious issue which is a public policy issue, but it takes us away from what we are talking about right now. Nonetheless, let me flag it. How much does the government collect as taxes today? Union government plus states, 17% of GDP. Ask people, how much should we spend on infrastructure? China does more than 10%, so we should do 10%. Education extremely important. I'm talking about public expenditure now. Education extremely important. 6%, 16%. Health extremely important. 4%. We are at what? We are at 20% already. Defense, how can I forget defense? I'm at 3% of GDP, 23% of GDP already. In the present scheme of things, about 67% of union government tax revenue was going to states as a result of the 14th Finance Commission and the central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. You add the compensation that is being given for GST, it comes to 80%. The more fundamental issue is that all the time we are talking about things like finance commissions and devolution from union to states. Devolution within states is much more important, but let's leave that be. But this was a process of historical evolution. The Constitution in many respects emerged from the Government of India Act, which through various channels emerged from the Monumental reforms, ideas behind the Monumental reforms. In other words, devolution cannot be de-linked from the censure. If I say health is a state subject, but nonetheless, because health is nationally important, the union government should pay for health, then by the same token, state should also pay for defense, for national highways, for airports, or whatever it is. So there is a much broader debate which has not happened in India yet about the constitutional provisions on devolution, which is not just the Finance Commission, but the 7th schedule is the flip side. It's something that we should look at.
Right. Now,
No, I'm Vivek, brilliant. And Raj also, I thought your comments were excellent. I'm just reminded of two things. One is, as you pointed out, in some fact, we sort of stole the point that I was about to make. You already sort of answered what I was going to ask. But the real question is, if you look at this vacancy question, 30% in the judiciary and vacancies, you see it also in police. You see it also in with regard to nurses, health workers, teachers, and of course the solution there is to sort of
go for para teachers, and then you have all this corruption in recruitment and so on and so forth. So it's actually a larger, I would say almost a fiscal problem, reflecting a relatively low tax state, as you said, and a lack of consensus on devolution. On the schemes, obviously, it's partly a question of the central government, I think, just wanting more political control and support in states through the proliferation of schemes. It's a way of asserting the power of blind ministries vis-a-vis state governments. I'm just putting that point on the table. You might disagree with it. So, you know, I don't think this issue of the judiciary can be tackled as a separate issue. You have to look at it as part of the larger delivery conundrum in India, in the context of this whole question about resources. So that's just one quick point. The other thing that struck me in the whole discussion was there are these symptoms of pathology. I mean, the 30 million number, the symptoms of pathology. The fact that you have all of these appeals going forward, the government clogging the court, as it were, and then you unravel the puzzle and you find, well, it's actually because of the CBI and CDC, the risk of being, you know, punished for taking a decision, or status in the judiciary, the lack of a clear client, that champion that will actually push forward reform and stakeholder sort of indifference. I mean, the 60 million number, yes, it shows there's a great deal of interest, but then comparatively, what is the mitigating population across states? So the question is, you've got the symptom, but when you look at the symptom, you actually realize you're talking about much larger issues that need attention and a strategy to actually push through governance reform. And I think that's a huge battle. So I just stop there. I don't, you know, those are just a bunch of reflections.
Two reactions. Firstly, whatever may have been the origin of the centrally sponsored schemes, now the centrally sponsored schemes are cast in stone. The union government has no control over them, in the sense that once this government came into being, there were committees of chief ministers. Every chief minister was a member of one committee or the other. And the three relevant committees were, one was on the Swachh Bharat mission, headed by Chandrababu Naidu. The second one was skills, headed by Prakash Singh Badal. And the third one on the centrally sponsored schemes proper was Keshavraj Singh Chauhan. So all the centrally sponsored schemes are as per the recommendation of the Keshavraj Singh Chauhan committee.
I'm just talking historically, I'm not talking
So as of today, it's cast in stone. It will, of course, be re-looked at because it is co-terminus with the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. So after that, we have to see what NKC means. On the other bit, obviously it's a complex problem. But I'll just give you two small remarks because it is a complex problem. One is, in some cases, what happens is the advertisement and the appointment selection process begins after individual X has retired. There is no logical reason why you should do that because you already have the profile, you know the retirement profile, and there's absolutely no reason why you cannot administrate it without changing anything.